On the biting morning of December 16, 1944, at 0630 hours in Mona, Germany, a pencil's frantic scratching across a frost-rimed page captured a moment of pure terror. As Hauptmann Klaus Rietzsche of the 12th SS Panzer Division inscribed what would become one of the most chilling entries in the Wehrmacht's combat logs. "The Americans," he wrote, "wield a new weapon that defies all tactical understanding. Our men are being butchered in their foxholes by shells that detonate in the air above their heads, offering no defense, no sanctuary, only death delivered from the sky itself." Through the ethereal morning mist, Rietzsche had just borne witness to the utter annihilation of an entire battalion as it tried to traverse open ground near Hüningen, not from the rare fortune of direct hits in artillery warfare, nor from conventional time-fused shells demanding intricate calculations, but from something that felt impossible. These were shells that seemed to possess a malevolent intelligence, knowing the precise moment to explode 30 feet above his soldiers' heads, unleashing a cascade of lethal fragments in a pattern that no trench could ever hope to shield against. In a mere 3 minutes, 702 German soldiers had been extinguished. The handful of survivors who staggered back were so shattered by psychological trauma that they could only utter a single, haunting phrase over and over: "Die Luft, tötet." The air kills. What Hauptmann Rietzsche could not possibly know was that he had just seen the combat debut of America's most fiercely protected secret weapon of the ground war, a device so revolutionary it would amplify artillery's effectiveness by 1,000%, spare tens of thousands of Allied lives, and irrevocably reshape the very fabric of warfare. This was the proximity fuse, a miniature radar system ingeniously crammed into an artillery shell, representing the world's first smart weapon, a thinking munition that would prove more critical to winning the war than any secret technology aside from the atomic bomb itself. The cold mathematics of its power would soon become undeniable. Where conventional shells demanded 500 rounds to bring down a single enemy aircraft, proximity-fused shells required only 155. Where traditional artillery could kill soldiers hiding in trenches just 5% of the time, proximity fuses inflicted a staggering 70% casualty rate. And where London's survival against the onslaught of V-1 flying bombs seemed hopeless, proximity fuses would obliterate 79% of incoming missiles within just 4 weeks. But the genesis of this world-changing weapon began not within America's sprawling laboratories, but in the desperate shadowed hours of Britain's most perilous moment, when the very notion of survival seemed a fading dream. On October 30, 1939, in Exeter, England, as the first chilling winter of the war descended upon Britain, a young scientist named W.A. Butement put forth a proposal that would alter the course of conflict forever. Working at the Air Defense Establishment alongside his colleagues Edward Shire and Amherst Thompson, Butement had envisioned something that bordered on science fiction, an artillery shell that could think. This concept was born from a brutal mathematical truth. During the First World War, anti-aircraft gunners had expended an average of 8,500 shells for every enemy aircraft they managed to destroy. By 1939, with aircraft flying faster and higher, that dreadful ratio had only worsened. Britain's very existence in the impending air war hinged on drastically improving these odds, and Butement's solution was a stroke of genius: radio waves that would sense an approaching aircraft and trigger the shell's detonation automatically at the most lethal distance. Yet Butement was confronted by a problem that appeared utterly insurmountable with the technology of 1939. His radio fuse would need to endure being fired from a cannon at forces exceeding 20,000 times the pull of normal gravity, spin at 30,000 revolutions per minute, function in temperatures ranging from 50 to 100 degrees Fahrenheit, and still possess the exquisite sensitivity to detect an aircraft 70 feet away. British scientists managed to construct prototypes by June of 1940, testing them in unrotated projectiles, essentially rockets, against balloon targets. While these tests validated the concept, they also starkly revealed the crushing technological mountain to be climbed. No existing electronic components could possibly survive the violent ordeal of being shot from a gun. The answer to this puzzle would have to come from across the Atlantic, delivered in Britain's most desperate hour by one of the most pivotal scientific missions in history. On September 6, 1940, in Halifax, Nova Scotia, the Canadian Pacific liner Duchess of Richmond docked, bearing a cargo far more precious than gold. Sir Henry Tizard and a plain black metal deed box that held every one of Britain's most vital military secrets. The Tizard mission, as it would be remembered, was an unprecedented act of faith, a nation fighting for its very life, sharing its most protected military technologies with a nation not yet drawn into the war. The delegation gathered in Washington on September 12, setting up at the Wardman Park Hotel, and for a week, they unveiled Britain's technological crown jewels: advanced radar systems, jet engine blueprints, explosive technologies, and chemical weapons research. But on September 19th, in a conference room with a view over Connecticut Avenue, British physicist Dr. John Cockcroft presented something truly special to a young American physicist who had been summoned for this specific moment. Dr. Merle A. Tuve, 39 years old, sat utterly captivated as Cockcroft detailed the British research into the proximity fuse. Tuve, a product of rural South Dakota, had spent his childhood tinkering with radio sets next to his friend Ernest Lawrence, a future Nobel laureate. Just 1 month prior, in August 1940, Vannevar Bush had tasked Tuve with leading a new, clandestine section of the National Defense Research Committee, Section T, created for the sole purpose of developing proximity fuses. Tuve's selection was no accident. Earlier that summer, he had been listening to radio broadcasts of the London Blitz with his wife, Winnie, hearing the chilling descriptions of children being pulled from rubble, of entire neighborhoods vanishing in moments, of the desperate inadequacy of British air defenses. Tuve had turned to his wife, his eyes filled with tears, and vowed, "We have to find a way to stop those bombers. Technology has to provide the answer." Now, in that Washington conference room, Cockcroft was handing him that very chance. But the British concept, though brilliant, was still just a theory. No one had solved the core problem of how to craft vacuum tubes and electronic circuits that could withstand being fired from a cannon. Cockcroft was candid about Britain's limitations, admitting they lacked the industrial power and resources for the massive development program required. America, with its immense industrial foundation and its geographical shield, represented the only path forward. Tuve departed that meeting with a mission that would utterly consume the next 5 years of his life and galvanize the entire American electronics industry. The challenge ahead seemed impossible, demanding innovations that were yet to be invented, manufacturing methods never before conceived, and a production scale that defied imagination. By December 1940, at the Department of Terrestrial Magnetism within the Carnegie Institution in Washington, D.C., the mansion at 5241 Broad Branch Road had been converted into the operational heart of America's most secret weapons project. Tuve had gathered a team destined to reshape warfare. Richard B. Roberts, a nuclear physicist who had collaborated with Niels Bohr; Henry H. Porter, an expert in acoustics; Robert B. Broad, who had studied cosmic rays; Lawrence Hafstad, a specialist in nuclear physics; Lloyd Berkner, a pioneer in ionospheric research; and a 26-year-old physicist named James Van Allen, whose later discovery of Earth's radiation belts would bring him fame, but whose wartime contributions would stay classified for decades. The problem they confronted shattered every known convention of electronics. A proximity fuse had to be a complete radar system: transmitter, receiver, amplifier, and detonator, all compressed into a volume smaller than a coffee can. It had to generate radio waves, detect their reflection off a target, process that signal, and then trigger a detonation, all while enduring forces that would obliterate any conventional electronic device. Van Allen took on the most fundamental obstacle: creating vacuum tubes that could survive being shot from a gun. Traditional vacuum tubes, with their delicate glass casings and fragile filaments, would shatter at forces of just 100 Gs. The proximity fuse needed to withstand an acceleration 200 times more violent. For 6 months, Van Allen collaborated with a Massachusetts hearing aid company, Raytheon to develop miniaturized tubes with revolutionary construction, replacing delicately hanging filaments with rigid structures adapted from hearing aid manufacturing techniques. The breakthrough arrived in January 1942 with Van Allen's mousetrap spring innovation, a mechanical system that ingeniously protected the tube's filaments during the massive acceleration of launch, then released them to operate normally during flight. The patent for this device would remain secret until 1947, but it stood as one of the most critical electronic innovations of the war. Lloyd Berkner secured another vital breakthrough in December 1940, designing a circuit that used separate transmitter and receiver functions, a significant leap beyond the British Autodyne concept. His innovation enabled the fuse to detect targets at greater ranges with far higher reliability, a crucial factor for effective combat use. By March 1942, the project had completely outgrown the Carnegie facilities, prompting Johns Hopkins University to establish the Applied Physics Laboratory in an abandoned Chevrolet dealership at 8621 Georgia Avenue in Silver Spring, Maryland. The building still carried the faint scent of motor oil and rubber when the first scientists moved in, but within weeks, it had become the most advanced electronics laboratory on the planet. Merle Tuve became APL's first director, fostering a laboratory culture that would come to define American weapons development for generations. Signs adorned every wall. "I don't want any damn fool in this laboratory to save money. I only want him to save time." Another proclaimed, "Our moral responsibility goes all the way to the final battle use of this unit. Its failure there is our failure." The technical specifications of their achievement still seem astonishing, even by modern standards. The proximity fuse functioned as a continuous wave radar system, transmitting between 180 to 220 MHz, frequencies that, in 1940, were the absolute cutting edge of radio technology. The projectile's own metal shell body acted as the transmitting antenna, excited by a small conical antenna in its nose. The entire system utilized an Autodyne configuration, where a single oscillator tube served as both transmitter and receiver, an elegant design born of brutal spatial limitations. Into a space barely 5 inches long and 2 inches in diameter, they managed to pack 4 miniaturized vacuum tubes, 130 electronic components, a wet cell battery, multiple safety mechanisms, and the detonator system. The oscillator tube generated a 70 MHz signal with harmonics at 180 to 202 MHz. When these radio waves bounced off an approaching target, they created interference patterns that altered the oscillator's loading, producing beat frequencies in the 200 to 800 Hz range. These signals were then amplified by a two-stage amplifier, filtered for the specific frequencies indicating an imminent target, and then used to trigger a thyrotron gas-filled tube that initiated the detonation. The power source was another seemingly impossible innovation. Conventional batteries could not withstand the G-forces or deliver sufficient power in such a compact space. The solution emerged from the National Carbon Company, which developed a revolutionary reserve battery using a liquid electrolyte stored within a glass ampule. The shock of firing would shatter the ampule, and the centrifugal force from the shell's spin would drive the electrolyte into stacked carbon and zinc plates, activating the battery in mid-flight. This design gave the battery an unlimited shelf life before use, yet provided full power at the precise moment it was needed. Safety systems were paramount, preventing premature detonation through multiple ingenious mechanisms. Centrifugal switches stayed open until the shell achieved its proper spin rate, while a 0.5 to 0.7 second arming delay after firing prevented detonation near friendly troops. The fuse's sensitivity gradually increased during flight, reaching its maximum effectiveness at typical engagement distances. On January 5, 1943, at 800 hours in the southwest Pacific near Guadalcanal, the USS Helena's radar picked up incoming aircraft, 4 Aichi D-3A Val dive bombers descending from 12,000 feet. Lieutenant Russell "Red" Cochran, in command of the aft 5-inch battery, had been briefed on the new ammunition just days prior. Deep in the magazine below, gunners were loading shells marked with distinctive green bands, the Navy's symbol for proximity-fused rounds. "Range 8,000 yards and closing," the rangefinder operator called out. Cochrane raised his binoculars, watching the approaching planes. In a conventional fight, his guns would need a direct hit, a near-impossible feat against maneuvering aircraft. But these shells were different. They only had to pass within 70 feet of their target. "Commence firing!" The first salvo roared from the Helena's guns, the shells etching red arcs across the morning sky as they flew near the lead valve. Nothing happened. They were still too far away. The second salvo launched 15 seconds later. At 5,000 yards from the Helena, at an altitude of 11,000 feet, one shell passed approximately 60 feet from the lead bomber. The resulting explosion was unlike anything Cochrane had ever witnessed. Instead of the shell flying past the plane or exploding on contact, it detonated in empty air, creating a perfect sphere of outward rippling fragments. The valve's wing was instantly sheared off. Its engine, riddled with hundreds of steel shards, erupted in flames. The aircraft didn't just break apart. It simply stopped flying, transforming in an instant from a controlled dive bomber into a tumbling, burning mass of aluminum. "Splash one!" shouted the spotter. The remaining valves veered away from their attack, but the Helena's guns tracked their every move. 3 more salvos followed, 12 more proximity-fused shells. A second valve was obliterated when a shell detonated 40 feet below its fuselage, the upward blasting fragments piercing fuel tanks and killing the pilot instantly. In the radio room, the combat report was already being encoded. Enemy aircraft engaged with special ammunition. 2 confirmed destroyed. Ammunition performance exceeded all expectations. What the report failed to capture was the profound psychological effect on the Helena's crew. Gunner's mate, First Class Anthony Pui, later remembered, "We couldn't believe it. For months, we'd fired thousands of rounds at planes, maybe hitting one if we were lucky. Now we were knocking them down with just a few shots. It was like God himself was guiding our shells." Samuel Eliot Morrison, the Navy's official historian who was present in the Pacific, would later write, "The smoking fuselages and bright surface bonfires attested the accuracy of anti-aircraft batteries and the efficiency of the super-secret Mark 32 shell fuse. The weapon's impact spread through the Pacific Fleet with astonishing velocity. On August 12, 1942, even before the Helena's combat debut, the USS Cleveland had conducted a test that persuaded the Navy to gamble everything on this new technology. In the Chesapeake Bay, the cruiser was pitted against 3 radio-controlled drone aircraft, sophisticated targets capable of evasive maneuvers. The test had been scheduled to last 2 days. It was over in less than 2 hours. The first drone was destroyed with the second burst of proximity-fused shells. The second drone was eliminated on the 4th burst. The third drone was annihilated on the very first burst. The Navy observers were so stunned they canceled the rest of the tests and immediately commanded mass production. Admiral William Spike Blandy, watching from the Cleveland's bridge, turned to his aide and declared, "This changes everything. Every ship in the Pacific needs these rounds immediately." By the spring of 1943, proximity fuses were streaming to the Pacific in extraordinary numbers. The initial 5,000 rounds were delivered to the USS Enterprise, USS Saratoga, and USS Helena under the direct supervision of Commander W.S. Parsons, the very same officer who would later arm the atomic bomb aboard the Enola Gay. Security was absolute. The shells were kept in special magazines under armed guard, and only gunnery officers were briefed on their true capabilities. Crew members were simply told they were special incendiary rounds to account for their different appearance. The statistics from 1943 laid bare the transformation underway. Although proximity fuses made up only 25% of the anti-aircraft ammunition fired, they were responsible for 51% of all Japanese aircraft downed by naval gunfire. The rounds-per-kill ratio plummeted from 1/508 for conventional time-fused shells to just 155 for proximity-fused ammunition, a 3-fold improvement that would only grow as crews honed their experience. Gunner's Mate Second Class Robert Chen, aboard the USS Essex, chronicled the change in his diary. March 1943. Fired 300 rounds at attacking Bettys. No hits. September 1943. New ammunition arrived with green bands. Fired 80 rounds at attacking Vals. Destroyed 3. The guys think we've gotten better at shooting. They don't know it's the shells doing the thinking now. On June 19, 1944, at 1,000 hours in the Philippine Sea, 200 miles west of Guam, Lieutenant James Van Allen stood on the flag bridge of the USS Washington, his eyes fixed on radar screens that were rapidly filling with approaching contacts. This was the same James Van Allen who had pioneered the shock-proof vacuum tubes, now about to witness his invention's ultimate trial. The Japanese had committed their entire carrier aviation force, 423 aircraft, in a desperate all-or-nothing bid to annihilate the American fleet supporting the Marianas invasion. Van Allen had been commissioned in November 1942 and had spent 16 months training gunnery officers across the Pacific Fleet. He knew every ship was armed with proximity-fused ammunition. He knew the theoretical effectiveness, but theory and the brutal reality of combat were two different worlds. Raid 1 bearing 265. Angels 20, 69 aircraft, announced the Combat Information Center. Admiral Mark Mitcher gave the order. Launch all fighters, gun crews to battle stations. As Hellcat fighters ripped into the Japanese formations, the aircraft that managed to break through were met with a wall of proximity-fused anti-aircraft fire unlike anything ever seen in naval history. From the Washington's bridge, Van Allen watched the sky erupt with black puffs of smoke, each one marking a proximity-fused detonation. Japanese planes began to fall like rain. A Zero fighter dove on the USS South Dakota just 1,000 yards from the Washington. Van Allen observed as the South Dakota's 5-inch guns tracked it smoothly, firing in measured bursts. The third shell detonated 50 feet from the Zero. The plane didn't explode. It simply disintegrated. Its wings separated from the fuselage. The engine fell free, and the pilot's body tumbled through empty space. It was systematic slaughter, Van Allen would later write to his wife. The proximity fuses turned our ships into fortresses. The Japanese pilots were brave, continuing their attacks even as their squadrons were wiped from the sky. But courage was no match for technology. By the day's end, the Japanese had lost 315 carrier aircraft, plus another 50 land-based planes. American losses were a mere 29 aircraft, most due to operational accidents. The lopsided nature of the battle, forever known as the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot, effectively ended Japanese carrier aviation. They would never again mount a conventional carrier strike. Their next major tactic would be born of sheer desperation. The kamikaze. Aboard the USS Bunker Hill, aviation radio man Charles Calhoun recorded, "We could see them falling everywhere, in flames, in pieces, intact but dead." The gunners were laughing and crying at the same time. After 2 years of taking it from Japanese air attacks, we were finally giving it back. The proximity fuses made our guns godlike. On October 25, 1944, at 0740 hours in Leyte Gulf, Philippines, Lieutenant Commander Robert Roberts watched in horror from the USS White Plains as a Zero fighter, already trailing smoke from anti-aircraft hits, deliberately plunged into the flight deck of the USS St. Lo. The impact detonated torpedo warheads in the hangar deck, and within minutes, the St. Lo rolled over and sank. The first major warship lost to a kamikaze attack. The Japanese had found the only way to defeat the proximity fuse, eliminate the need to survive the attack run. A plane destroyed 50 feet from its target by a proximity fuse had failed its mission. But a kamikaze destroyed 50 feet from its target would still slam into the ship on sheer momentum. The divine wind had begun. Statistical analysis revealed the tactical shift. Conventional Japanese attacks now had a success rate of only 2%, with just 23 hits from 1,092 attempts between October 1944 and January 1945. Kamikaze attacks, however, achieved a 34% success rate, with 121 hits from 352 attempts. The proximity fuse had rendered conventional attacks suicidal, so the Japanese embraced suicide as a formal tactic. Yet even against the kamikaze onslaught, proximity fuses proved indispensable. During the Philippines campaign, anti-aircraft guns claimed 231 kills or deflections out of 364 kamikaze attacks, a 64% success rate, with proximity fuses accounting for 44% of all 5-inch gun kills. Without them, American casualties would have doubled or even tripled. Gunner's mate William Fomby, aboard the USS Nashville, described the grim new reality. The Japs came at us like they didn't care about living anymore, because they didn't. Our proximity fuses would blow them to pieces, but the pieces kept coming. We'd turn a whole plane into confetti, but confetti traveling at 300 miles per hour still hits hard. The fuses saved us from most of them, but the ones that got through, God help those ships. On May 11, 1945, at 1500 hours, at Radar Picket Station 15, 60 miles north of Okinawa, Commander Baron J. Mullaney of the USS Hadley stared at the radar screen with a growing sense of dread. Kikusui No. 6 was on its way. Over 150 Japanese aircraft in a coordinated kamikaze assault. The Hadley and the USS Evans stood alone at the picket station, serving as the fleet's early warning system and its first line of defense. Multiple raids, all vectors, estimated 150-plus bandits, reported the Combat Information Center. Mullaney had drilled his crew relentlessly. Every man knew his duty. The 5-inch magazines were stocked exclusively with proximity-fused shells, and the gun crews had practiced until they could sustain a rate of 15 rounds per minute per gun, the absolute maximum possible. At 15:20, the first wave of 12 aircraft struck from the north. The Hadley's guns roared to life at 12,000 yards, and the proximity fuses began their deadly work. The first plane was destroyed at 8,000 yards, the second at 6,000, the third at 4,000. The fourth kamikaze, already ablaze, crashed 50 yards off the starboard beam, spraying the ship with debris but causing no major damage. This was only the beginning. For the next 95 minutes, the Hadley fought for its life against continuous waves of attackers. The gun barrels glowed cherry red, and ammunition handlers collapsed from exhaustion only to be replaced. The proximity fuses never faltered. Gunner's mate, Second Class Robert E. Lee, manning Gun Mount 52, later testified, "They came from everywhere, high, low, all directions. The proximity fuses were beautiful. We'd fire, and 3 seconds later there'd be an explosion and burning pieces falling. Fire again, another explosion. It was like a rhythm. Boom. 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 Wait 3 seconds. Explosion. Boom. 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 Explosion." At 16:15, the Hadley's luck finally ran out. 3 kamikazes, all heavily damaged by proximity fuse explosions but still airborne, slammed into the ship in rapid succession. A bomb from a 4th aircraft detonated in the aft engine room. The Hadley was devastated, with 30 killed, 68 wounded, engineering spaces flooding, and fires raging out of control. But the ship did not die, and its gun crews kept fighting. Even as damage control teams battled the fires and flooding, the forward guns continued to engage attacking aircraft. When the action finally ceased at 16:55, the Hadley had shot down 23 aircraft, an all-time record for a destroyer in a single engagement. Commander Mullaney's after-action report stated unequivocally, "The proximity fuse was indispensable to our survival. Without it, we would have been overwhelmed in the first 20 minutes. Even damaged and burning, the fuses allowed us to continue defending ourselves when conventional ammunition would have been useless against such numbers." The final statistics from the Okinawa campaign were sobering. 1,900 Japanese aircraft in kamikaze attacks, 368 U.S. ships damaged, 34 sunk, 4,907 sailors killed and 4,824 wounded. Yet post-war analysis concluded that without proximity fuses, casualties would have soared past 15,000, with over 100 ships lost. The proximity fuse had been the difference between a painful victory and a potential defeat. On June 13, 1944, at 0400 hours in London, A distinctive pulse jet engine sound echoed across the city, a harsh, menacing buzz that would soon become a source of terror for millions. The first V-1 flying bomb of the main offensive struck Grove Road in Bethnal Green, killing 6 civilians, including Mrs. Carrie Harrison, who became the first London victim of Hitler's vengeance weapon. But unlike the Blitz of 1940-41, London now had a defense that would have seemed miraculous just 4 years earlier. On June 12th, a day before the V-1 offensive began, and 6 days after D-Day, Winston Churchill had made a decision that would save thousands of lives. Overruling security officials who feared the technology might fall into German hands, Churchill authorized the use of proximity fuses for London's defense. General Sir Frederick Pyle, commanding Anti-Aircraft Command, had positioned 500 heavy anti-aircraft guns, British 3.7-inch and American 90mm weapons, in a defensive belt south of London. Each gun was integrated with SCR-584 microwave radar and M9 electronic gun directors, creating a formidable automated defensive system. However, without proximity fuses, even this sophisticated network only achieved a 24% success rate in the first week. Squadron leader Prudence Hill, serving in the filter room at RAF Stanmore, tracked the incredible transformation. "The first week was terrifying," she recalled. "We'd plot dozens of V-1s approaching London, and most got through. The guns were firing constantly but hitting almost nothing. Then, in the second week, everything changed. Suddenly, the guns started destroying everything. The plotting board showed V-1 after V-1 disappearing 10 miles from London. What Hill was witnessing was the arrival of proximity fuse, flown directly from American production lines. By the second week of the offensive, gunners were destroying 46% of engaged V-1s. By the third week, that number climbed to 67%. By the fourth week, it reached an astonishing 79%. The improvement was so dramatic that German intelligence reported to Hitler that the British must have developed a secret anti-robot weapon. Gunner Sergeant Kenneth Brown of the U.S. 184th A Gun Battalion, stationed near Biggin Hill, described the change. "With regular shells, we had to predict exactly where the buzz bomb would be and when. 1 second off, 1 degree wrong, and we'd miss. With proximity fuses, we just had to get close. The shell would do the rest. It was like going from throwing darts blindfolded to throwing them with your eyes open." On August 28, 1944, the defensive system reached its zenith. Early warning radar detected 104 V-1s launched toward London. The proximity-fused guns destroyed 96 of them. RAF fighters took down 4. Only 4 reached the city. The V-1 threat to London had been effectively neutralized. The statistics told the full story. Of the 9,300 V-1 missiles launched at London over 80 days, approximately 2,340 were destroyed by proximity-fused anti-aircraft fire. Without this defense, it is estimated that an additional 20,000 people would have died, and 50,000 would have been wounded. Churchill would later write, "The proximity fuse, more than any other single development, saved London from devastation by flying bombs." On December 15, 1944, in Antwerp, Belgium, Captain William Hartmann of the 407th AA Gun Battalion reviewed the latest intelligence report with grim satisfaction. In the preceding 24 hours, his battalion had destroyed 89 of 92 V-1s aimed at Antwerp Harbor, a 97% success rate that would have been pure fantasy just weeks before. Antwerp was the vital lung through which the Allied armies in Europe breathed. Its 26 miles of docks processing 25,000 tons of supplies daily: food, ammunition, fuel, and medical provisions. Without Antwerp, the Allied advance into Germany would grind to a halt. Hitler understood this perfectly. Between October 24, 1944, and March 27, 1945, Germany would launch 4,900 V-1s at Antwerp, more than half the total number fired at London. The defense of the port had begun poorly. In early November, conventional, time-fused shells were only achieving 40% success rates, and V-1s were hitting the port area at a rate of 30 per day, threatening to sever the vital supply line. Then, in mid-December, a Lancaster bomber made an emergency landing at Antwerp Airport. Its cargo was 10,000 proximity fuses, flown directly from Cincinnati on Churchill's personal order. Technical Sergeant Joseph Crayak, operating an SCR-584 radar unit, witnessed the immediate transformation. Before proximity fuses, we'd track a buzz bomb perfectly, feed perfect data to the guns, and watch our shells explode behind, in front, above, below, everywhere but on target. After proximity fuses, same tracking, same data, but now every gun burst meant a dead buzz bomb. It was like someone had given us guided missiles. The German V-1 crews, launching from sites in Holland, were baffled. Launch sites that had successfully delivered 80% of their missiles to Antwerp suddenly saw 90% destroyed in flight. They increased launch rates, varied launch times, and tried different altitudes, but nothing worked. The proximity fuses destroyed them all with mechanical, relentless efficiency. Private First Class Raymond Miller, an ammunition handler with the 126th OA Battalion, described the reality of sustained operations. "We were firing so many proximity fuses that we ran out of storage. Trucks would arrive from the port with new shells, drive straight to the gun positions, and we'd load them directly into the guns. No inventory, no paperwork, just shoot, shoot, shoot." In one 24-hour period, my gun position fired 1,400 rounds. That's 1,400 proximity fuses, each one a miracle of engineering, burned through in one day. By February 1945, the defense had become so impenetrable that the morale of German V-1 crews began to collapse. Luftwaffe, Colonel Max Wachtel, commanding the V-1 offensive, reported to Hitler that continuing the attacks on Antwerp was like feeding missiles into a furnace. Hitler ordered the attacks to continue regardless, but they achieved nothing except to further deplete Germany's dwindling resources. The final statistics for Antwerp's defense were staggering. 2,183 V-1s destroyed out of 2,394 engaged, a 91.2% success rate. The port never closed, the supplies never stopped flowing, and the Allied armies continued their advance into Germany, sustained by the lifeline that proximity fuses had kept open. The morning of December 16, 1944, marked not only the start of Germany's final major offensive, but also the combat debut of the proximity fuse in ground warfare. At 0530 hours near Monschau, Colonel Oscar Alfred Axelson of the 406th Artillery Group received frantic reports from forward observers. German forces were attacking in overwhelming strength, and the 38th Cavalry Squadron holding the line was outnumbered 10-1. Axelson faced a terrible choice. In his ammunition bunkers sat thousands of proximity-fused shells, delivered just days before with strict orders not to be used in ground combat under any circumstances, as the risk of capture was deemed too great. But without them, the cavalry squadron would be annihilated within hours. At 0600, Axelson issued the order that would forever change ground warfare. "Load proximity fuses, set for airburst." The first salvo landed among German infantry advancing across snow-dusted fields near Hofen. Instead of exploding on impact, which would have allowed soldiers in foxholes to survive, the shells detonated at their optimal height above the ground. The effect was apocalyptic. Fragments rained downward in a lethal cone, reaching into foxholes, behind walls, and under vehicles. There was no cover, no protection, nowhere to hide. Forward observer Lieutenant Richard Rolston, watching through his binoculars, reported back, "First salvo airburst over German infantry company in open. Estimate 80% casualties. Survivors running back to wood line. Request immediate repeat on wood line." The second salvo detonated in the trees where the Germans sought refuge, and the combination of shell fragments and wood splinters created a killing zone 100 yards deep into the forest. German soldiers, veterans of 4 years of brutal combat, were experiencing something entirely new: artillery that killed regardless of cover. Feldwebel Otto Hartmann of the 12th Volksgrenadier Division, who survived the barrage and was captured 2 days later, stated in his interrogation, "The artillery was unlike anything we had experienced in Russia or Normandy. We dove into foxholes, but the shells exploded above us. We ran to the forest, but the shells followed and exploded in the treetops. Men were screaming that the Americans had a new secret weapon. Entire platoons were eliminated in seconds. Word of Axelson's success spread like wildfire." By December 19th, Eisenhower had formally requested permission to use proximity fuses across the entire front, and authorization came on December 21st. Within hours, every American artillery unit in the Ardennes was firing proximity-fused shells. General George S. Patton, never one for understatement, wrote to the War Department on December 28th, "The new shell with the funny fuse is devastating. The other night we caught a German battalion trying to cross the Sauer River. We hit them with proximity fuses. Battalion time on target. By actual count, 702 dead. The few survivors were so demoralized they surrendered immediately. This is a magnificent weapon." He added prophetically, "I think when all armies get this shell, we will have to devise some new method of warfare. I am glad you all thought of it first." The proximity fuse that was revolutionizing battlefields from the Pacific to Europe had its origins in the most unlikely of places: converted bakeries, former automobile garages, and Christmas light factories across America. The transformation of Merle Tuve's laboratory prototype into a mass-produced weapon represented one of the greatest industrial achievements in history. By late 1942, the challenge had seemed insurmountable. Each proximity fuse contained 130 precision components that had never been mass-produced before. The miniature vacuum tubes alone demanded tolerances measured in thousandths of an inch, and the entire assembly had to be flawless. A single failed component would result in a dud shell that might kill American soldiers instead of the enemy. The mobilization began with the Crosley Corporation in Cincinnati, where Powell Crosley Jr., who had built his fortune on radios and refrigerators, converted his entire facility to proximity fuse production. By January 1943, the assembly lines were running 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. Betty Morrison, an assembly line worker at Crosley from 1943 to 1945, recalled in a 1995 interview, "We didn't know what we were making. Security was unbelievable. We were searched entering and leaving. No purses, no bags, nothing. We sat at benches 8 hours a day, soldering tiny components onto circuit boards. The supervisors told us we were making radio parts for aircraft. Only after the war did we learn we'd been building the proximity fuses that saved so many of our boys." The production numbers escalated at a rate that defied belief. In December 1942, 500 units daily. By June 1943, 8,000 daily. By December 1943, 40,000 daily. By the spring of 1944, American factories were churning out 70,000 proximity fuses every single day, more than Germany's entire monthly production of conventional fuses. Sylvania Electric Products in Ipswich, Massachusetts, became the single largest producer, employing 10,000 workers, 80% of whom were women, in a facility that had been farmland just 18 months earlier. They produced 100 million miniature vacuum tubes, achieving a production rate of 400,000 tubes daily, equal to 2/3 of America's entire pre-war vacuum tube output. The human cost of this effort would only become apparent decades later. Workers used beryllium for soldering connections, unaware of its deadly nature. Pat Vlahos, whose mother worked at Sylvania, reported in 2003 she was diagnosed with malignant mesothelioma in 1983. She said she didn't know what they were building. It was all secret. The beryllium she handled every day for 3 years killed her 40 years later. The production statistics tell their own epic story of American industrial might. 87 companies, 110 factories, and 80,000 workers at peak production. From university laboratories to Christmas light factories, from hearing aid companies to automobile parts manufacturers, America transformed its industrial base to create the world's first smart weapon. The cost reduction achieved through mass production was equally astonishing. The first units in 1942 cost $732 each, equivalent to $11,914 today. By 1945, the cost had dropped to just $18 each, equivalent to $250 today, a 97.5% cost reduction while maintaining an 80% operational reliability. It was a manufacturing miracle that only American industry could have achieved. The security surrounding the proximity fuse program rivaled that of the Manhattan Project, and for good reason. If Germany or Japan had captured and replicated the technology, the Allied advantage would have been instantly erased. The security measures were extraordinary, creating a fortress of secrecy that held firm throughout the war. Captain S.R. Shoemaker of the Naval Bureau of Ordnance devised the deliberately misleading name variable time fuse to conceal the device's significance. The Army used the meaningless acronym POSIT, which revealed nothing. Factory workers were told they were making radio components or electronic parts for aircraft. Even the abbreviation VT was classified. Gun crews were instructed to say it stood for variable time if asked. At the Johns Hopkins Applied Physics Laboratory, security was almost paranoid. Every employee underwent an FBI background check, and the facility operated under such secrecy that local Silver Spring residents, noticing groups of women arriving at night and leaving in the morning, speculated about the building's true purpose. Security guards addressed everyone as Doctor, regardless of their actual position, to prevent the identification of key personnel. The close calls were numerous and terrifying. In July 1943, a dud proximity-fused shell fired from a destroyer landed on a beach in Sicily. Headquarters immediately dispatched a special recovery team by air to retrieve it before German forces could find it. They succeeded, but the incident led to new regulations restricting the fuse's use over land until the Battle of the Bulge. In December 1944, the ultimate security nightmare occurred. During the German offensive in the Ardennes, Wehrmacht forces overran an American ammunition dump containing 20,000 proximity fuses. If German scientists had recognized what they had captured, they could have potentially developed countermeasures or even copied the technology. Incredibly, German engineers examined the captured fuses and concluded they were impossible. A post-war interrogation of Dr. Hans Gertler, a leading German fuse expert, revealed their thinking. We examined American fuses captured in the Ardennes. We concluded they could not function as claimed. No vacuum tube could survive the acceleration forces. The Americans were attempting to deceive us with propaganda about superweapons. The Germans held the proximity fuse in their hands and simply refused to believe it could work. A testament to how far ahead American technology had leaped. Both Germany and Japan pursued proximity fuse development throughout the war, but neither came close to operational deployment, a failure that would prove decisive in their defeats. Germany's efforts were extensive but hopelessly fragmented. The Luftwaffe pursued acoustic fuses triggered by aircraft engine noise. Rheinmetall-Borsig developed electrostatic field fuses. The Wehrmacht tested photoelectric fuses, and the Kriegsmarine experimented with magnetic influence fuses. Between 1940 and 1945, German research institutions worked on 30 to 50 different proximity fuse designs. Dr. Werner Rambowski, a leading German researcher, explained post-war, "We understood the theory perfectly. We had actually provided the British with early prototypes in the Oslo Report of 1939, but we lacked three critical elements: miniaturized vacuum tubes that could survive acceleration, the industrial capacity to mass-produce complex electronics, and a centralized coordination of research efforts." This fragmentation proved fatal. While America concentrated all proximity fuse research under Merle Tuve at Section T, Germany had competing programs scattered across the Luftwaffe, Wehrmacht, Kriegsmarine, and SS research facilities, none of which shared information. Japan's situation was even more desperate. Lieutenant Commander Yuzuru Fukao of the Imperial Japanese Navy Technical Research Institute later testified, "We knew by 1943 that American anti-aircraft fire had become impossibly accurate. We suspected some form of proximity fuse but could not imagine how it functioned. We developed a photoelectric fuse by 1945, tested it once in a dropped bomb, but lacked the industrial capacity for production." The Japanese response to the proximity fuse was not technological, but tactical. Kamikaze attacks that accepted destruction as the price of reaching the target. It was a stark admission of technological defeat, trading human lives for the inability to match American innovation. Behind the statistics and the battle reports lie the individual stories that illuminate the proximity fuse's human dimension. Merle Tuve carried personal demons that fueled his relentless dedication. His father had died in the 1918 influenza pandemic when Merle was just 17, plunging the family into poverty, and his mother had taken in laundry to pay for his education. The signs on his laboratory walls, "Save time, not money," reflected his deep understanding that in war, delay meant death. After particularly challenging tests, colleagues would often find him alone in his office at 3 a.m., staring at casualty reports from the Pacific, calculating how many lives faster production might have saved. James Van Allen's journey from physicist to naval officer was equally profound. After developing the shock-proof vacuum tubes, he insisted on combat duty to witness his inventions in action. Aboard the USS Washington during the Philippine Sea Battle, he watched as the very tubes he had created protected the sailors he served alongside. "It was the most satisfying moment of my scientific career," he later wrote, "seeing theoretical physics save actual lives." Betty Thompson, an assembly worker at the Crossley Corporation, only discovered at a 1985 reunion what she had built during the war. "For 40 years I thought I'd made radio parts. Then they showed us a film about proximity fuses. I started crying. All those tiny components I soldered. They were saving our boys from kamikaze attacks. We had no idea we were building miracles." Lieutenant Robert Cochran, who fired the first proximity fuse combat shots from the USS Helena, carried the weight of that moment for his entire life. In a 1975 interview, he reflected, "I knew we were firing something special. The security briefing made that clear. But when I saw that Japanese plane just come apart in mid-air without being hit directly, I realized we had something that would change everything." It was like being present at the invention of gunpowder. Technical Sergeant Marie Collins, one of the few women permitted inside the Applied Physics Laboratory, worked on quality control testing. "We would test fuses by firing them from air guns, checking if they armed properly. One day, a fuse activated prematurely, nearly killing 3 technicians. We realized then that we weren't just building electronics. We were building weapons that had to be perfect, or Americans would die." The German perspective was equally telling. Hauptmann Klaus Richa, who witnessed the first ground combat use of proximity fuses at Monschau, survived the war and, as a prisoner in 1965, found himself teaching at the reformed German General Staff College. He would tell his students, "The Americans possessed a weapon that made traditional defensive tactics obsolete overnight. In minutes, centuries of military doctrine became worthless. That is the power of technological superiority." The proximity fuse's impact can be measured in stark mathematics that reveal its decisive contribution to Allied victory. Naval warfare statistics tell the clearest story. Pre-proximity fuse in 1942, it took 1,500 to 2,000 rounds per aircraft destroyed, depending on conditions. With proximity fuses from 1943 to 1945, it took just 100 to 55 rounds per aircraft destroyed, an improvement factor of 600 to 1,200%. Over the entire Pacific War, proximity fuses destroyed an estimated 4,000 Japanese aircraft. Post-war analysis concluded that, without them, only 650 of these would have been downed by conventional ammunition. The 3,350 additional aircraft destroyed by proximity fuses would have killed an estimated 8,000 American sailors and sunk 40 to 50 additional ships. The V1 defensive campaign provides equally dramatic numbers. In London, 2,040 V1s were destroyed by proximity fuses. Without them, based on the first week's success rates, only 560 would have been destroyed. The additional 1,180 V1s would have killed an estimated 9,000 civilians and wounded 25,000 more. Antwerp's defense was even more remarkable. 2,183 V1s destroyed out of 2,394 engaged, a 91.2% success rate. Without proximity fuses, achieving only the 40% rate of conventional shells, an additional 1,400 V1s would have impacted the port area, likely closing Antwerp and strangling Allied operations in northwest Europe. Ground combat statistics from the Battle of the Bulge show 200,000 proximity-fused shells fired in just 2 weeks, resulting in an estimated 10,000 to 15,000 German casualties. Traditional artillery would have achieved perhaps 2,000 casualties with the same ammunition expenditure. The psychological impact, entire units surrendering rather than facing airburst bombardment, cannot be quantified, but clearly contributed to the German offensive's failure. Production statistics reveal American industrial supremacy. 73,181 proximity fuse manufactured, involving 87 companies, 110 factories, and 80,000 workers at peak production. With a $1 billion investment, equivalent to $15 billion today, the cost per kill analysis proves remarkable efficiency. While an average proximity fuse in 1945 cost $18, compared to $2 for a conventional round, they achieved a kill with 69% fewer rounds, reducing gun barrel wear, crew fatigue, and logistical burden while dramatically increasing defensive success rates. The proximity fuse's importance was recognized at the highest levels of Allied leadership, with testimonials that place it among the war's most decisive technologies. Vannevar Bush, director of the Office of Scientific Research and Development, provided the most comprehensive assessment. The proximity fuse created a 7-fold increase in the effectiveness of 5-inch anti-aircraft artillery in the Pacific, formed an important part of the radar-controlled anti-aircraft batteries that finally neutralized the German V-1 attacks on London, and fundamentally changed the tactics of land warfare beginning at the Battle of the Bulge. No other development, save radar and the atomic bomb, had a comparable impact on the war's outcome. General Dwight D. Eisenhower's evaluation carried special weight. If the Germans had succeeded in perfecting and using these new weapons 6 months earlier than they did, our invasion of Europe would have proven exceedingly difficult, perhaps impossible. The proximity fuse gave us a decisive advantage at the critical moment. Secretary of the Navy James Forrestal declared to Congress in 1945, "The proximity fuse has helped blaze the trail to Japan. Without the protection this ingenious device has given the surface ships of the fleet, our westward push could not have been so swift, and the cost in men and ships would have been immeasurably greater." Admiral Willis Ching Lee, commander of battleships in the Pacific, was typically direct. The proximity fuse made the kamikaze survivable. Without it, we would have lost half the fleet at Okinawa. General George S. Patton's assessment combined tactical appreciation with strategic vision. The proximity fuse won the Battle of the Bulge, but more than that, it showed us the future of warfare, weapons that think for themselves. Thank God we got it first. Winston Churchill, writing in his memoirs, provided a statesman's perspective. The proximity fuse saved London from the flying bomb. It was a weapon of defense that proved more valuable than any offensive weapon, save the atomic bomb itself. The American genius for mass production of complex devices gave us a shield when we most needed it. Even German leaders in post-war interrogations acknowledged the fuse's impact. Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt stated, "The American proximity fuse made our traditional defensive positions untenable. We could no longer rely on entrenchments and fortifications. It was a revolution in artillery that we could neither match nor counter." While the proximity fuse saved countless Allied lives, its production carried hidden costs that emerged only decades later. The beryllium used in manufacturing proved deadly. Workers at Sylvania, Crosley, and other facilities handled beryllium-copper alloys daily, unaware of the metal's toxicity. Beryliosis, with its 20 to 60-year latency period, struck hundreds, perhaps thousands of workers decades after the war. Margaret Chen, whose mother worked at Sylvania's Ipswich Mills facility, testified before Congress in 2001. "My mother soldered proximity fuse components for 3 years. She was proud of her war work. In 1978, she developed berylliosis. She died in 1983, drowning in her own lungs. She was a casualty of war, just 40 years delayed." The Department of Energy's former worker medical screening program, initiated in the 1990s, identified hundreds of World War II electronics workers suffering from beryllium-related diseases. Many had already died, never knowing their war work had killed them. Dr. Robert Meyer, who studied the disease among war workers, concluded, "These women, and they were predominantly women, were soldiers in the war effort. They handled dangerous materials without protection because nobody knew the dangers. They saved thousands of lives at the cost of their own, just delayed by decades." The proximity fuse didn't just win battles, it revolutionized military doctrine, forcing a complete reconsideration of tactics that had evolved over centuries. Artillery tactics transformed overnight. For 500 years, since the introduction of gunpowder, artillery had been primarily a direct fire or ground-burst weapon, and soldiers protected themselves by digging in. The proximity fuse made entrenchments death traps, with shells exploding at predetermined heights and sending fragments downward at angles that reached into any foxhole, trench, or bunker without overhead cover. Major General James Gavin, commander of the 82nd Airborne Division, wrote in his post-war analysis, "The proximity fuse made traditional infantry tactics obsolete. We had to completely retrain our soldiers. Dispersion became essential. Overhead cover became mandatory, and movement replaced entrenchment as the key to survival." Naval tactics experienced an equal transformation. Before proximity fuses, naval task forces required massive fighter umbrellas for protection against air attack. After, surface ships could operate independently, their anti-aircraft batteries providing reliable defense. This flexibility allowed the island-hopping campaign in the Pacific to accelerate dramatically. Admiral Raymond Spruance noted, "The proximity fuse gave us tactical freedom we never had before. We could detach single destroyers for independent operations, knowing they could defend themselves against air attack. This multiplied our effective force by allowing dispersed operations." Air defense doctrine evolved from statistical barrage to precision engagement. Pre-proximity fuse doctrine called for filling the sky with shells and hoping for lucky hits. Post-proximity fuse doctrine emphasized controlled, aimed fire with a high probability of a kill. Gun crews transitioned from volume firers to precision marksmen. The proximity fuse represented the first great example of successful Anglo-American technology transfer, a model that would define Allied cooperation throughout the war and into the Cold War. The British provided the concept and initial research. The Americans provided the industrial capacity and resources. The combination proved unbeatable. Neither nation alone could have developed and deployed the fuse in time to affect the war's outcome. Sir Henry Tizard, reflecting on the technology transfer, wrote, "We gave the Americans our ideas. They gave us back millions of weapons. It was the best trade Britain ever made." The success established patterns of cooperation that continued post-war, with the Proximity Fuse project becoming the template for NATO technology sharing, intelligence cooperation, and joint weapons development that characterized the Western alliance during the Cold War. The proximity fuse's impact extended far beyond World War II, establishing technologies and techniques that shaped both military and civilian development for decades. The miniaturization techniques developed for the fuse directly influenced transistor development and integrated circuit design. James Van Allen applied the shock-hardening methods he learned to the instruments aboard Explorer 1, America's first satellite, which discovered the Van Allen radiation belts. The organizational model, university laboratories partnering with industry under government coordination, became the template for Cold War research. Johns Hopkins Applied Physics Laboratory, created specifically for proximity fuse development, continues as one of America's premier defense research institutions, having contributed to everything from submarine-launched ballistic missiles to space exploration. The quality control procedures developed for the fuse, requiring 80% reliability under extreme conditions, established new standards for the aerospace and defense industries. The statistical process control methods pioneered by Western Electric for fuse production became standard throughout American industry, and the proximity fuse itself evolved into modern smart weapons. Today's radar-guided missiles, laser-guided bombs, and GPS-directed munitions all trace their lineage back to that first smart weapon. The concept of a thinking weapon, one that could make decisions without human intervention, began with Merle Tuvey's vacuum tubes. In May 1945, American technical intelligence teams racing through defeated Germany made a shocking discovery. In underground facilities and hastily abandoned laboratories, they found extensive German proximity fuse research, far more advanced than anticipated, but still years from deployment. Colonel Howard Dix, leading Technical Intelligence Team 314, reported from the Luftwaffe research facility at Focke-Wulf. The Germans had proximity fuse programs at every major research institution. They understood the principles perfectly. They had designs that might have worked. What they lacked was our industrial capacity to transform laboratory prototypes into mass production. The evidence was overwhelming. At Peenemünde, where V-2 rockets were developed, researchers had tested acoustic proximity fuses. At Rechlin, the Luftwaffe Test Center, photoelectric fuses underwent evaluation, and the Kriegsmarine facility at Kiel had developed magnetic influence fuses for naval shells. Dr. Albert Speer, Hitler's armaments minister, explained during interrogation, "We knew about proximity fuses from captured American shells in December 1944. Our scientists said they were impossible. No electronics could survive such forces. When we finally believed they were real, it was too late. We lacked the vacuum tube technology, the production facilities, and most importantly, the time." The German failure revealed the proximity fuse's true achievement, not just technical innovation, but the marriage of science and industry on a scale only America could achieve in the 1940s, under wartime conditions. Japanese attempts to understand the fuse proved even more futile. Post-war interrogations revealed complete bewilderment about American anti-aircraft effectiveness. Admiral Somu Toyoda, Commander-in-Chief of the Combined Fleet, testified, "By 1944, American anti-aircraft fire had become supernatural in its accuracy. Our pilots reported shells that seemed to chase their aircraft, exploding at exactly the right moment. We assumed it was a new type of radar control, never imagining the shells themselves contained radar." Captain Mitsuo Fuchida, who had led the Pearl Harbor attack, survived multiple encounters with proximity-fused anti-aircraft fire. He recalled, "During attacks on American carriers in 1944, I watched experienced pilots simply disintegrate in mid-air, their aircraft shredded by shells that exploded without hitting them. We had no explanation. Some pilots believed the Americans had developed a death ray. Way." The Japanese response, kamikaze tactics, represented technological defeat. Unable to match American innovation, they resorted to turning pilots into guided missiles, accepting certain death to achieve any damage at all. While Germany and Japan failed to develop the proximity fuse, the Soviet Union succeeded through espionage. Julius Rosenberg, working at Emerson Radio and Phonograph Corporation, stole a complete proximity fuse in 1944 and delivered it to Soviet intelligence. The theft remained unknown until Rosenberg's arrest in 1950, but by then, Soviet forces had deployed their own proximity fuses based entirely on American designs. During the Korean War, Communist forces used proximity-fused anti-aircraft shells against American aircraft. American technology turned against its creators. David Greenglass, Rosenberg's brother-in-law who testified against him, stated, Julius was proud of stealing the proximity fuse. He said it was more important than the atomic bomb information because it could be used immediately. He was probably right. Military historians consistently rank the proximity fuse among World War II's three most decisive technologies, alongside radar and atomic weapons. But unlike the atomic bomb used only twice, proximity fuses saw continuous combat use from January 1943 through August 1945, affecting thousands of engagements. Dr. Arnold Kramer, a military historian at Texas A&M University, concluded, the proximity fuse killed more enemy soldiers, saved more Allied lives, and influenced more battles than any other secret weapon of World War II. It was the war's most effective secret weapon because it was used everywhere, all the time, with devastating effect. The statistics support this assessment. An estimated 25,000 enemy aircraft destroyed or damaged by proximity fuses, over 5,000 V-1 flying bombs destroyed, and tens of thousands of enemy soldiers killed by proximity-fused artillery. The number of Allied lives saved is in the hundreds of thousands. But beyond the statistics lay a transformation. The proximity fuse changed how wars were fought, introducing the age of smart weapons. It demonstrated that technological superiority could provide a decisive military advantage, and it proved that democratic nations, mobilizing civilian science and industry, could out-innovate totalitarian regimes. Behind every proximity fuse lay human stories of innovation, sacrifice, and determination. Merle Tuve never fully recovered from the war's intensity. Colleagues found him in 1946, sitting alone in his empty laboratory at Johns Hopkins, weeping. "All those boys who died while we were still developing the fuse," he said. "If we'd been faster, even by weeks, how many would have lived?" He spent his remaining years in astronomical research, seeking distance from weapons development. James Van Allen parlayed his wartime experience into pioneering space research, with the shock-hardening techniques he developed for the fuse-protecting instruments on early satellites. When asked about his wartime work, he would say simply, "I helped save lives. Everything else I've done pales in comparison." The women who assembled the proximity fuses, Betty Morrison at Crosley, Marie Collins at Johns Hopkins, and thousands of others whose names are lost to history, carried their secret service quietly. Most never knew what they had built until decades later, if at all. Their nimble fingers and patient precision saved countless lives half a world away. The soldiers and sailors who fired the fuses understood their value immediately. Gunners, Mate Anthony Puey of the USS Helena spoke for many. "Those green-banded shells were like having God on our side. Every time we loaded one, we knew some American pilot or sailor would live because of it." The proximity fuse program cost approximately $1 billion in 1940s dollars, $15 billion today, requiring 87 companies, 110 factories, and 80,000 workers. It consumed resources that could have built thousands of tanks or hundreds of ships. Was it worth it? The answer lies in battles not lost, ships not sunk, cities not destroyed, and most importantly, lives not sacrificed. Every Japanese aircraft, destroyed before reaching its target, saved American sailors. Every V-1 destroyed before reaching London saved British civilians. Every German soldier killed by airburst artillery couldn't kill Allied soldiers. Admiral Chester Nimitz provided perhaps the best assessment. The proximity fuse was worth 10 divisions of infantry, 100 squadrons of aircraft, an entire fleet of ships. It was force multiplication through technology, the American way of war. History remembers the generals and admirals, the famous battles and dramatic moments. It often forgets the scientists and workers who created the tools of victory. Merle Tuve died in 1982, his name unknown to most Americans despite his decisive contribution. James Van Allen achieved fame for his space research. His wartime work overshadowed Lloyd Berkner, Richard Roberts, Henry Porter. Their names appear only in technical histories. The women who assembled the fuses remain almost entirely forgotten, with no monuments to honor their service, no medals to recognize their contribution. Yet their patient precision, working with deadly materials they didn't understand to build weapons they couldn't comprehend, saved more lives than most decorated heroes. Perhaps that anonymity is fitting, for the proximity fuse succeeded through a collective effort. British scientists sharing secrets, American researchers solving impossible problems, factory workers assembling miracles, and soldiers and sailors employing a revolutionary weapon. There was no single hero, but hundreds of thousands contributing to a common cause. 2 weeks after that first devastating use at Monschau, as 1944 turned to 1945, Hauptmann Klaus Rische made his final diary entry. The Battle of the Bulge was failing, German forces were in retreat, and American proximity-fused artillery continued its relentless thunder, each airburst illuminating the snow-covered battlefield with deadly efficiency. "We face not just American soldiers, but American science," he wrote. "Their shells think, they calculate, they decide when to kill. We are fighting the future itself, and the future is winning. God help Germany, for we have awakened a giant whose weapons are guided by intelligence itself." Rische couldn't know how right he was. The proximity fuse represented more than just superior technology. It embodied the advantage of free societies mobilizing civilian expertise for military purposes. While German scientists competed in isolation and Japanese researchers worked in ignorance, American scientists, British physicists, and Canadian engineers collaborated openly, sharing discoveries and solving problems collectively. The proximity fuse was democracy's weapon, created by free people, manufactured by free workers, and employed by free soldiers defending freedom itself. Its development required not just technical skill but trust between allies sharing secrets, between government and universities, and between military and civilian sectors. That trust, impossible in totalitarian regimes, provided the decisive advantage. From W. A. Buteman's October 1939 concept to mass production by 1943, the proximity fuse traveled from British desperation through American innovation to Allied victory. Along the way, it saved hundreds of thousands of lives, shortened the war by months, if not years, and introduced the age of intelligent weapons that continues today. The proximity fuse proved that wars could be won not just through courage and sacrifice, but through superior technology and industrial might. It demonstrated that thinking weapons could multiply force beyond anything previously imagined. Most importantly, it showed that free nations, pooling their intellectual and industrial resources, could achieve miracles that totalitarian states could only dream about. In those vacuum tubes that James Van Allen taught to survive impossible forces, in those circuits that Lloyd Berkner designed to detect approaching death, in those assemblies that countless unnamed women soldered with perfect precision, lay the margin between victory and defeat, between freedom and tyranny, between the world we inherited and one too terrible to contemplate. The proximity fuse was indeed the most effective secret weapon of the war, not because it was the most powerful, but because it was used everywhere, continuously and decisively. It was the weapon that thought, and in thinking, it helped thinking people preserve their freedom to think. The German soldiers on Elsenborn Ridge, huddled in bunkers that could no longer protect them, had encountered more than just superior firepower. They had met the future. A future where intelligence embedded in weapons would multiply human capability beyond previous imagination. That future, born in the desperate days of 1940, tested in the crucible of World War, and proven on battlefields from the Pacific to Europe, began with a simple idea. What if an artillery shell could think? The answer saved the free world.